All right. Thank you so much. Welcome to another episode of the Love, Hope, Lyme podcast. My name is Fred Diamond. Of course, I'm the author of Love, Hope, Lyme, what family members, partners, and friends who love a chronic Lyme survivor need to know. The book is available on Amazon. Nicole and Kent, I've given out the PDF version of the book for free since the book was published, and we've given out over 5,000 copies. If you'd like a PDF of that book, if you're a chronic Lyme survivor looking for some support, reach out to me via social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I'll be happy to get that to you. And Nicole and Ken, I still get maybe 10, 15 people a week who reach out, and I'm more than happy to do that. If you'd like a signed copy of Love, Hope, Lyme, reach out to me and we'll accommodate that. I've had people buy dozens or a dozen copies for their family members to hand out. I want to let people know that I need to make a disclaimer. Even though this is a podcast about Lyme disease, this is not a replacement for medical treatment. If you are looking for some issues, for some help with your Lyme disease or tick-borne disease, please seek proper medical care. If you're watching this on YouTube, thank you so much. Go up and give us a thumbs up and ask questions. There are some shows that we get a dozen questions and we get them all answered throughout the course. So Nicole and Ken, I encourage you to jump up periodically and see. If you're watching this on Apple Podcasts, thank you so much. Give us a 5-star review. We would greatly appreciate it. All right, this is the Love, Hope, Lyme podcast, and I'm very excited for today's show for a couple of reasons. One, of course, we have Nicole Malachowski, who was on the show before. Go up to YouTube and search Love, Hope, Lyme and watch her show. And she's been very vocal, and we'll talk about in a little bit about her journey with Lyme disease. But we're talking about I think it's a critical report that has come out. It's the NASEM Report. It's the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And the report is called Charting a Path Toward New Treatments for Lyme Infection Associated Chronic Illnesses. And we're going to be talking about that today, how the report came about, and more importantly, how the report's going to be used and the value of the report in the world. So I'm thrilled to have you both here. Why don't you both introduce us? Nicole, again, a lot of people watching this have seen you. You're doing a lot of posts, which we'll talk about. Give us a brief introduction. Then Kent, give us a brief introduction about you.
You bet. So my name's Nicole Malachowski. I spent over 21 years as an officer and a fighter pilot in the United States Air Force. And essentially my career came to a screeching halt very unexpectedly overnight due to a tick bite. And I'm one of the people, that 20%, if you will, that get Lyme disease, get treatment, and then still have complex chronic symptoms. And so let's see, I was medically retired almost 8 years ago. And in these past 8 years, I've kind of made it my new purpose and my new mission to try to move the ball forward in this space so that what happened to me doesn't happen to other people.
Yeah, for people watching, I encourage you to follow Nicole definitely on Facebook and LinkedIn. You're doing a lot of great publications on LinkedIn as well. And I presume you're up on other places as well. People can find you wherever they search for their social media. Kent, give us a little bit of an introduction to you as well.
Sure. So my name's Ken Kester. I'm an infectious disease physician. I spent about almost 25 years in the U.S. Army, U.S. Army
Mm.
Medical Corps, and sort of had an interesting career both in terms of medical research, where I did vaccine development, but also provided clinical care, caring for patients with HIV, Gulf War syndrome, other chronic diseases and ailments associated with Lyme disease, et cetera. I'm currently the executive director of research and development at CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and just happy to be here.
Very good. Well, I'm always excited to talk to two people on the Love Hope Line podcast who are much smarter than me. So this is going to be this is going to be an exciting show for our audience. Nicole, but seriously, first of all, for both of you, thank you for all your service to our country. Nicole, you were featured on the Love Hope Line podcast. Believe it or not, it was 2023
Wow.
when we did the interview, and I encourage people to listen to that show to hear your story, which is actually quite remarkable. But I've noticed over the last maybe year or so that you significantly increased your commitment to Lyme treatment, research, and diagnostics advocacy since then. Give us some insights into what led to this.
Well, I think the more that, a patient or a caregiver family shares their story, the more I think I get feedback from other people. And you realize that by individually sharing our stories, right, there can be a ripple, effect. And also by sharing my story, that certain opportunities, come to bear. So when I got the email asking me to represent patients on this NASEM committee, that was a big deal. And also, being on that committee for a year really expanded my mind, scientifically, policy wise, and everything in between. And so I learned things from other committee members that I started kind of delving into. And that has resulted, I think, in the increased posts and increased educational kind of things I'm trying to do across social media.
Yeah, that's great. So Kent, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine published the report, like I mentioned before, charting a path toward new treatments for Lyme infection-associated chronic illnesses. Give us a little bit of background on the NASEM, the NASEM, for people who don't know, and what led to this report being published.
So the national academies were chartered, I guess, about over 150 years ago as an independent entity intended to help advise the U.S. government on matters of science. It includes the National Research Council and a variety of academies, as you mentioned. Um, and so, in addition to advising the U.S. government, it also serves as sort of a convening role for other scientific questions that are of national and international importance. So the this particular report, it's very interesting. I chair another National Academy activity called the Forum on Microbial Threats. And it evaluates things of microbial threats. So essentially emerging infectious diseases or reemerging infectious diseases. And about 2 years ago, we decided to do a workshop on the chronic effects of infectious disease. And so at the time, this is we're hearing about long COVID, with not just a handful of people, but lots and lots of people. So it's a real thing, an accepted entity. And so we use that as a stepping off point to evaluate a variety of infectious diseases and some chronic conditions of uncertain etiology that have been seen. And one of them, of course, was Lyme. And so I think that report was well received. And the Cohen Foundation then came to the National Academies and said, this is what we're really interested in is the chronic effects associated with Lyme disease. We see that you've already started to scratch the surface on this more broadly, and we'd like to sponsor a study, a so-called consensus study. And so that's what kicked it off. And it's really focused on, Lyme, of course, the sort of the chronic impacts of Lyme. But the interesting thing, of course, is as we saw in our previous workshop, is there are a lot of parallels with other infectious diseases. And so it really raises a lot of interesting questions, both in terms of trying to discern the etiology, the reason, mechanisms, but also perhaps, and ideally, especially for patients, opportunities to provide treatment, which in the end, if you read the report, I know you read the report, our focus is always on patients. We want to know the science, we want to understand mechanisms, that's all great. And of course, that will be very helpful in developing therapeutic interventions, but we want to focus on the patients, and that's the bottom line of the report.
Yeah, first off, thank God for the Cohen Foundation for the work that they've done, the Stephen Alexander Cohen Foundation with LymeX and everything that they've devoted to Global Lyme Alliance and all those places as well. And yeah, so and I did read the report from the first word to the last word. And FYI, I encourage people to do it as well. There is a summary of the report that's also available as well. And it just goes so deep into I like what you just said to why this applies to patients, right? And it's all about, yes, it's about science, of course, but it's about solving these problems and giving the community of Lyme survivors, I like to say, providing peace to a community that needs it. So interestingly, when I published Love, Hope, Lyme, with family members, partners, and friends who have a chronic Lyme survivor, need to know, and a number of people reached out to me about the term chronic Lyme. And I know it's a controversial term in some regards. The term discussed in the report is chronic Lyme infection associated illness. For both of you, Nicole and Kent, help us understand what this term means and why is it important? Nicole, why don't you go first?
You bet. We're calling it Lyme IACI, IACI being infection-associated chronic illness. And it goes back to what Kent was just hitting on, right? We know, and the CDC acknowledges that nearly 500,000 people, are diagnosed with Lyme, and upwards of 20% of those people, or 100,000 people a year, remain chronically ill. What we don't know is why, right? What is the actual causal mechanism for this? And so by using the term IACI, we're kind of casting the net wide, keeping that umbrella, I think, very open, to all possibilities. And when we use that term chronic Lyme in the patient and the caregiver community, oftentimes we're referring to chronic symptoms, and sometimes we're referring to a hypothesis that it's a chronic persistent infection. And so what you have is you have different stakeholders interpreting that phrase chronic Lyme differently. And so by using this kind of more umbrella term, IACI, we're hoping to capture, I think, all of those perspectives and kind of get us aligned moving forward on finding the reasons and, of course, the treatments for this. Kent?
Yeah, I think we would all agree that the acronym IACI isn't, it's not a very euphonic type sound, but for what it's worth. But I think the point that Nicole raises is, we know that across Lyme, we know that diagnostics are, shall we say, not the best. And so diagnoses are often not made. And so what we wanted to do was to be very inclusive, recognizing that this whole sort of compilation or constellation of symptoms is still ill understood, and so we didn't want to try to exclude people with just a very narrow focus, because in the end people are hurting, and to be very exclusionary when we're really not clear on the outer bounds of what these diagnoses are didn't seem to make sense.
It's a great point that people are hurting. And Nicole, I want to ask you a question. Unlike other chronic illnesses, Lyme, IACI, patients fight both physical and mental aspects of tick-borne diseases and inconsistent care. And that comes out very clearly throughout the report, as anybody listening to this particular podcast has experienced themselves. And you obviously have experienced a lot of this firsthand. We're doing today's interview. I should have mentioned this in late August of 2025. Our medical system has been failing Lyme survivors, which is it's really unacceptable in this day and age. Why have we gotten to this point?
I think that it was something, early on, right? When you go back a couple of decades, when these first Lyme IACI patients were talking about, their chronic symptoms, it wasn't seen as such, a big deal. We now know, right? Tick populations are exploding. We know that Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses are being diagnosed at a greater rate. You add on the, if you will, catalyst of the suffering of long COVID patients, and we're kind of reaching this kind of pinnacle, crescendo kind of moment now where we're finally getting, the attention that it deserves. And at the end of the day, right, this is about making it a priority. And when you're working with government or you're working with government funding, we need it to be a priority so we can get the funding for it so that we can do the research. Because ultimately, I know a lot of patients and caregivers feel like me, science is what's going to bridge the gap between this Lyme IACI patient experience and what, current medicine is doing. And honestly, when you look at the doctors who are willing to treat us, who enthusiastically do the best that they can, we haven't given them the tools necessary, right, to have the impact that they want. And so hopefully the roadmap that's coming out of this committee report is going to result in those physicians being able to actually treat their patients.
That was one of the thoughts I had as I was reading the report. And I've gone to ILAD meetings and I've seen you, of course, on Capitol Hill. And that was one of the things that I've recognized, relatively early on was that a lot of the tools weren't being provided, et cetera. And there wasn't the big swell, right, of awareness, if you will, in the overall marketplace. We just had a couple big announcements this summer. Justin Timberlake, of course, announced that he believed he had Lyme disease, which has brought a tremendous amount of attention. The report that y'all had published was picked up by the Wall Street Journal, which got a lot of attention. I had a conversation with the reporter who said she heard of this report, did some research, and that's what led to the famous Wall Street Journal report from the summer of 2025. Ken, many people think that Lyme is just about arthritis, flu-like symptoms, maybe carditis. We mentioned before, it's estimated that hundreds of thousands of people are struggling with what the report is calling Lyme IACI, which is about chronic fatigue, recurring pain, cognitive and neurological dysfunction, sleep disturbances, despite receiving the recommended antibiotic treatment for Lyme disease, the famous, 3 weeks of doxycycline, if you will. Tell us more about this distinction.
So the symptoms that you mentioned at the outset are ones that are commonly associated with acute Lyme disease. Bitten by a tick today, and maybe in a week or two, you may get some of these symptoms. And some of the symptoms may occur whether or not you're treated, and sort of the etiology of those symptoms is still not completely clear. Is this an immune effect? Is it invasion by the organisms or something else? We really don't know. Um, but but the majority of people who are either asymptomatic or who have some of these acute symptoms and are appropriately treated, don't have chronic illnesses that follow. However, we obviously know that many do, and this really isn't a new thing. I think what we've seen though, and I think as I mentioned earlier, people recognize that, for instance, long COVID is a real thing. And guess what? There are many similarities of the symptoms. And so now it dawns on people, well, maybe this Lyme business with some of these chronic impacts, maybe this is a real thing too. And then on top of that, of course, as I mentioned before, our diagnostics are suboptimal. Um, we have reasonable antibiotic treatment regimens, but are they the best? Are they ideal? I don't think we really know. And are there other approaches that could be used there? Perhaps. And so I think what this tells us is, you know, there's an unknown thing here, and why some people have brain fog, and why some people have unexplainable pain, and why some people are chronically fatigued. These are all real things, and I think just the recognition, as opposed to, well, this person's just depressed, they need some antidepressants, or they need to get more sleep, or something like that. Maybe some people do, like anyone else, but that's not, this is much bigger than that. And so I think that the key take home message is this is very much distinct from acute Lyme. And that's really, we can say, well, we can treat acute Lyme, and I would say, yeah, we can, with all the caveats that I mentioned before about perhaps we could do better. But this is a distinct sort of constellation of symptoms, and it's real. It's real.
Yeah. So the report makes 6 recommendations. Do you want to hit on one or two of them that you want to focus on? Again, I encourage people go back and read the complete report to see it. And there's a summary also, but why don't you hit on like maybe one or two of the key recommendations that the report recommends?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, there are 6 recommendations, and I would encourage people to take a look. I think one of the big areas that the committee, and I would mention, the committee really represented kind of a diverse panel of people, everything from experts in infectious disease to diagnostics, patient focused, medical ethics, et cetera. I mean, quite a range of people. Um, and one of the key areas that was noted from the outset that everyone, basically knew, but we dug into it much more, is that the studies of these chronic impacts of Lyme disease are wanting. The number of studies, the scope of the studies, the size, the degree of scientific rigor, the reproducibility, if you will, of these studies is somewhat limited. And if one hopes to be able to, one, understand what's going on, and two, frame potential interventions, you'd really like to have solid scientific plans to sort of evaluate them. And so one of the key areas was, you know, let's get some really well-designed studies to evaluate these patients, whether these are natural history studies, interventional studies, or more, and to get that data in a manner that can be accessed and evaluated and accumulated, so that you can start seeing patterns. This is what's happened with long COVID. We have millions of people with long COVID. There's a lot of data out there, and with all the clinical studies that have been done with COVID. So it's about time. that this Lyme, which has been around much longer than COVID and has affected a lot of people, really gets that same degree of scientific rigor, so we can help make a difference. I
Nicole,
think
I'm
that's
just
I think that's a key recommendation.
yeah, Nicole, I have a question for you. I'm going to go a little bit off script here, but I'm just kind of curious. As you were involved with the committee over, and how long was the process from let's meet till the report? Was it about a year, I guess?
Yeah. It was about just, I think it was 13 months. I think it was 1 month beyond, like April through May.
I'm just curious on your personal evolution as you were, again, you've been vocal. I had you on my podcast in 2023. I've seen you speak. I'm just kind of curious on you personally, how you evolved, if you don't mind, if you can dig into this over the 13 months that you were on the committee.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said before, and as Kent had mentioned, that this committee was extraordinarily diverse. And what I loved about the makeup of the committee is, roughly half the people, in the room were familiar, with Lyme disease, tick-borne illness, and this concept of Lyme-Iacke. The other half were actually coming at it from a very open-minded, very, never having worked on it before kind of perspective, but bringing their expertise to it. So I loved to see kind of those two worlds collide and collaborate, on this really, what is essentially a pretty darn gnarly issue. I also got really, involved at a lot more deep level with all of these national and global level patient and caregiver type nonprofits. I learned
Mm.
a lot more about what they have to offer. And that's kind of what I wanted to add on, Kent,
Mhm.
talking about the recommendations. Inside of those recommendations is this deep need, I think, for the research and medical community to partner at a much deeper level with the patient, nonprofits and the caregivers. There is a plethora of data out there, a plethora of people waiting to be a part of these clinical trials, waiting to give their opinion, to do the surveys, to give of themselves. And that has been an underutilized and I think untapped resource. And so being able to be the patient in the room and go, look, we're talking about all these things we want to do on this roadmap. Here's what I'm telling you. Some of that data already exists. How come we're not reaching out and partnering? A lot of ways too is when patient-centered groups kind of meet with research, sometimes it can feel very transactional. So this idea that I'm advocating and the committee is hearing me, let's involve the patients from day one, right? From study design, all the way through execution to being part of, the study results and forward steps. So that was just a fun thing to be part of.
Yeah, I'm just yeah, Ken.
So maybe I would add is when you read the report, you can hear Nicole's voice throughout the text, because all throughout the report, the emphasis on involving patients, the patient view of the world, because it's true. And I think, if you're a real sciencey kind of person, you focus on the science stuff, and the patients are the source of samples or data or whatever. But here we have a situation where the patients really have to be in the center, and whether it's helping to inform or advise on some of the strategies, to be able to provide input and perspective and more, I think is critically important. And I think that comes through loud and clear throughout the report.
I think it definitely did. And one of the challenges with Lyme disease, it's as people are listening to the show, they may be lying in bed, right? They may be sitting on their couch
Mhm.
thinking, okay, great, I'm glad this is being done, but I haven't worked in 3 years. Which leads to the next question is, I was on social media this morning. Again, we're doing today's interview with Nicole Malachowski and Kester, right? And we talked about, I was looking at a board discussion on one of the social medias, and someone was stating that their family left and their spouse left and their brother doesn't believe them. And then there was 50 comments below, my family doesn't believe me, they think I'm faking this, blah blah blah. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote my book 3.5 years ago, was because that was something. How do you think this report uh, can be used or will be used to counteract organizations, I guess, that have denied that chronic Lyme even exists?
Here's what I want patients and caregivers to know. Here's what I want the people that are laying on the couch right now, just like I did for 2 years, what I want them to know. NASEM is chartered by Congress. It is the collective scientific voice of the United States of America. And for the first time ever in history, right, the United States of America is saying Lyme IACI is real. I want people to feel validated by that. I want them to realize they're not alone. And I want them to have hope in this roadmap for the future. The other thing I want them to know is look at the title of the report, right? We're looking at treatments. You know, we have spent decades trying to find causal mechanisms, biomarkers. We've definitely dug in the last 5 years trying to really improve these diagnostic tests. And all those things are needed and all of those things are important. What we're saying in this report is people are suffering now. We need to, in parallel, right, multiple lines of effort, be working on treatments now. That this suffering matters, and we can't continue to wait for causal mechanisms and biomarkers, which will eventually come because science will get there. In the meantime, can we do these things in parallel to limit or prevent this kind of suffering? So we see you, and we're working on this, and finally, the United States of America is acknowledging this suffering.
That's a great point. Again, the report is called Charting a Path Toward New Treatments for Lyme Infection Associated Chronic Illnesses. Ken?
Yeah, just to add to that, we make the point throughout the report is that the science is still important, but we don't want to neglect working on therapeutic interventions, until we get a mechanism 10 or 20 or 30 years from now. And so the point that's made throughout is that these things need to be done in parallel and not in series. And so I fully expect as time goes on, we will clearly learn more. One of the outputs of our previous workshop on just more generic, I suppose, chronic illnesses associated with infectious disease was there appear to be a number of similar sort of pathways that may be playing a role. Now, how those work and what that all means, I think is still too early to say. But I mean, so that work needs to progress. But I wouldn't just sit back and wait, whatever period of time until, some Nobel, Prize related stuff comes out. Because right now, again, patients are hurting, and
Yeah.
whether it's the physical symptoms, whether it's the stigma that's associated with, how they are perceived either in the workplace, at home, their families, with their friends, it's a real problem. And so this work has to go in parallel with the science.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Nicole.
I was going to say, the patient community, especially over the last 10 years, has gathered their data, right? Has put in their surveys, has shown, hey, here are things, treatments that I've tried that I believe have worked for me. The question is, why aren't we going to patients and going, okay, what was that treatment you tried? How many of you tried it? How many of you said it had a positive outcome? Because maybe we need to look into that. Maybe, just maybe, right? We can figure out the why behind that specific treatment and why it's working for you. And wouldn't it be fascinating if that could work us backwards the other way? And Kent, please help me with the proper scientific term, but work us backwards towards the biomarker and the causal mechanism. These
Yeah,
things are all interconnected. And so there's a way that maybe that's, translational.
that's the word, translational.
Okay.
So maybe what I could add is as Nicole points out, the mobilization of the patient community. So if you think back to the 1980s when this mysterious immunodeficiency syndrome appeared and no one knew what it was, and eventually it was identified as a virus, HIV, as we know. And think back to the impact that the patient community had in charting new directions in research, in advocacy, with very profound ways of working to get the point across. Here we have an opportunity with the national academies. Again, the academies themselves are not the advocate per se, but by having a report that has the stamp of the national academies on it, it gives it a certain degree of high quality. And it then provides an opportunity for those who can make those decisions on funding, on policy, on research, to actually, here it is, here's the report, here's the roadmap, this is what you guys need to do. And we never intended to write the definitive textbook of Lyme disease. That's left to others. Our goal was not to actually say, you should, investigate, interventions X, Y, and Z, although we mention a number of them as potentially promising. That's left to others. But we wanted to make the point is, one, it's real. Two, it needs work. Three, it needs work now. And four, here's a roadmap that should be considered.
All right. That being said, again, it is a very comprehensive and well thought out and well produced report. What do you both what do you both hope that happens in the coming year in the Lyme disease world? Again, we're doing today's interview at the end of August, summer of 2025. And what are some of the major challenges that need to be addressed and solved for those to happen? I want to go first.
Well, I mean, I definitely want to see more patient involvement, more collaboration between these leading researchers and keeping us involved, in the clinical trials. I'm hoping that our decision makers, both in Congress, policy makers, federal government, verbalize this as a priority. Look at this committee report and go, yes, this is something that's actionable, and I'm willing to put, our prioritization or funding behind it. I cannot thank the Cohen Foundation enough, not only for what they did for this report, but what they do for funding a lot of these different kinds of studies. And so I just want to see action. And I also am really hopeful that the long COVID community, the myalgic encephalomyelitis community, fibromyalgia, the Lyme community are able to come together so that we're not overlapping, we're not wasting precious resources, that we're filling gaps, and that we can share this information, I think, in a way that can advance the science for all of us.
Yeah, what I would like to see, of course, is more focus on funding for this area, and that funding really needs to be across the spectrum on sort of the discovery science, but as well as funding focused on treatment opportunities and studying those treatment opportunities with an eye towards discerning what's going to work, I think, as I said previously, we have an interesting opportunity with the recognition, I think universal recognition about long COVID. It's a real thing. And so leveraging that and other types of chronic illnesses associated with certain infectious diseases, we have an opportunity. In the end, it's going to be up to the appropriators, to the people who make research policy funding decisions. And I think the involvement of the patient community, the patient advocacy community, is going to be essential because it keeps the pressure up, that this is a real thing. We don't want this just to be kind of, a single blip, and
Yeah.
then it goes on the shelf, or the virtual shelf, as it were. We want this to be continuing.
Before I ask you both for your final thoughts, again, I want to thank Nicole Malachowski, Ken Kester. First of all, the report, National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, charting a path toward new treatments for Lyme infection-associated chronic illnesses. Nicole, you're one of the most prominent people who has spoken about Lyme, and of course, uh, your role in the protecting the country has been documented and is amazing. Uh, What do you want the world to know about Lyme disease? What are a couple things you specifically want to make sure that if people who are listening aren't sitting on their couch, they're not Lyme survivors, what do you want people to know?
Lyme disease does not discriminate. We were
Mm,
all recruited into this club by a tick bite.
right.
Lyme disease is not just for, a certain group of people. It's for people who are very high performing. It's impacts elite athletes. It impacts world-class entertainers. It impacts the bravest and the toughest in our military. It impacts people who are leaders in your communities. And if it hasn't impacted you yet or somebody the chances are it's going to in the future unless we start to stem the tide with prevention, with better diagnostics, and certainly with improved treatments for all stages of disease.
No, that's a great point. I mean, people I've spoken to have gotten Lyme disease for no reason, walking through Central Park, on a kayak in the Ozarks. I know you were
That's
in North Carolina, obviously training to
right.
serve our country and to protect our country. And again, go back and listen to the Love Hope Lyme episode with Nicole to hear more about her specific story. All right, give us your final thoughts. Final thing you want to leave us with, Nicole. Since you just answered that question, I'm going to ask Kent first, and then you can wrap it up for us.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. So maybe what I'll do is my final thought is I'll paraphrase my final thought in the preface of the report. And so the overall goal is to effectively highlight those areas of medical intervention that can be applied to address and ultimately treat the multitude of current and future patients who suffer with Lyme IACI. Bottom line is our patients deserve better.
Very good. Nicole, why don't you bring us home?
One of the things I learned on the committee, more so than ever, is that there are some seriously extraordinarily talented, highly intelligent, totally motivated, scientists, researchers, and clinicians out here that are on our side. I thought I knew everybody who was a who's who in the space, but during that committee, I was learning about new people and new research facilities and things I just didn't know, and it heartened me. And I want people to know that you are believed, and there is an entire, horde of people that are actually behind us moving the ball in the right direction. So things are moving in the right direction. Yes, we want them to go faster. Yes, we need to keep advocating for that, but I can tell you the vector's in the right direction now.
All right. Once again, I want to thank Nicole Malachowski and Ken Kester. My name is Fred Diamond. This is the Love Hope Lyme podcast.